Welcome to our fifth now, well, counting down, there's 5 more left of our Startup Toolbox webinar series. We've put this series together in the UKI EIT Health CLC, and we're basically covering some of the major questions and major topics some of our startups have requested over the years. Today, we are welcoming the wonderful Danny Godfrey, who's going to talk to us a bit more about turning your research into medical devices. So Danny, it's great to have you. I'll give you all a brief background about Danny. So Danny is one of 2 founders of egtechnology, which is basically a product design and engineering company he started in Cambridge. They've grown and scaled the company to around 35 excuse me, engineering and commercial staff, which is quite an incredible feat. He's going to dive more into this topic for us. So if you guys have any questions, please do use the Q&A function or use the chat just to discuss. We're going to send you guys a link in the chat box of all the other webinars in the series, so do make sure you check them out. And just so everyone is informed, this session is going to be recorded and released onto YouTube at a later date. If you have anything you want us to cut from this, or if you want to ask a question, please do. We're happy to remove it for you. Just drop us an email afterwards. Danny, are you ready to take it away?
I think I am. Hopefully the technology will let me do so.
Sure, well, I've just made you host.
You just made me a host. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that introduction. Ala, you had promised not to embarrass me, and then you start off by calling me wonderful, which is very nice, but slightly embarrassing. But thank you anyway. So as Ala mentioned, this is part of the 5th ultimate of the Startup Toolbox webinars. I'm going to be spending the next hour or so talking about my experiences of turning research into medical devices. It's a pretty broad topic. I know that many of you are from startups, and I'm going to ask you how many are from startups in a moment, so I can just tailor maybe some of the content as we go through. And if for those of you who are in startups, your whole life is likely to be about turning an initial idea into that very first product. So hopefully some of the experience that I've gained over the last 23 years or so of doing this will be useful to you. So I'm just going to initiate a poll. This is the only question I'm going to ask you during the course of the hour, I promise. I've just popped up a poll, which hopefully will have pinged up on your screen, and it would be useful to get just a sense of where the audience comes from today. So I'll just let that run for another 15 or 20 seconds or so. We've got 10 responses at the moment. Startup is winning. Anybody else want to let on where they're from? Okay, that'll do for now anyway. So it looks as though we've got just over half of the people are from startups, and then a few people from industry and academia as well. Okay, so I'll just I don't know whether you can possibly see those results up there on screen at the moment. Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to tell you very briefly about me and why it might be worth you spending the next hour listening to what I've got to say. And then we'll get into some of the details of the differences between research and developing a medical device and some of the common pitfalls that we see as people go through this process. So that's me when I've got decent lighting rather than the grey sunlight coming through the window in Cambridge here this afternoon. I trained as an engineer. My background is as a mechanical engineer. Went into industry for a few years and then moved into consultancy and specifically designing medical and diagnostic devices. So I spent the last 23 years working in both medical and in vitro diagnostic development. I co-founded a company called egtechnology in 2002, and as Alan mentioned, we're now 35 people servicing largely startups, but also some much larger industrial clients and some academic institutions, usually as they are starting to move towards spinning something out. When I'm not doing work for clients, I also work as a grant assessor for a couple of different organizations, and I'm a mentor to a few companies as well. Very briefly, because this is not a sales pitch for us, but by means of giving you a background in what we do. As Ala said, it's a design and engineering consultancy. Clients range from very, very small. Most of our clients are fewer than 50 people, and many of them are fewer than 5. And we work with them to turn their research into medical devices, which is why I'm talking about this subject today. I've had the pleasure of working with many hundreds of companies over the last 23 years, some of whom have started as 2 people and have sadly finished as 2 people, a year or 2 afterwards, but many of whom have grown on to become very successful organizations. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the differences between the research world and the medical device world. We're going to, some of these things are going to seem like generalizations, and they are really, but I think there are some themes and some truths in this. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the common areas that we found people struggling with as they move from one world to the next through the startup phase, and try to give some pointers as to how to cope with those. So by some form of contrast, research comes from many different places. There are a couple of people from industry on this webinar. There are quite a few people from academic institutions, universities. A lot of research will start in a university, typically in the biomedical, physics, chemistry, biology departments, but we've worked with people who've actually been working on research coming from economics departments as well, because all of these areas can have an impact on medical care. And the objectives of the research can vary enormously, from just being interesting to trying to get a publication, to trying to fund the next postdoc or PhD, and of course sometimes to spin out a startup company. But originally, at least, the objectives can be very varied and not necessarily particularly well defined. When you move into medical device development, you have to have a very specific focus. You have to know what it is that you're trying to achieve. And you have to focus on it, not just for regulatory reasons, but also in terms of making sure that you can make as much progress as possible with the funds that you have available. So one of the things that we encourage people to do right from the outset is to really focus on what actually matters. And we'll talk about that in particular a bit later on. It can be quite a change of mindset going from this is really interesting, I've got this huge field that I can go and explore, to thinking, actually, I'm going to look at that particular thing, and I'm going to spend the next 5 years of my life working just on that to make it as good as possible. Research is fairly obviously typically based on getting a really deep understanding of the field that you're looking into, and that deep scientific understanding is usually essential if you're going to be able to convert it into a useful product. From the medical device world, of course, you need to understand that and very often learn from it, but you also need to focus very heavily on the safety and the efficacy of what you're doing. And that is very largely about being able to demonstrate that you're in control of what you're doing. And whereas researchers will, by and large, be in control of what they're doing, they will have much more freedom to move from one field to focus on something else if it looks like it's interesting or relevant. In the medical device world, you need to be maybe a little bit more constrained. And where research can be focused on blue sky thinking, at least initially, and there's lots of blue sky thinking when you start to come up with a medical device concept, there's lots of concept generation and idea generation and so on, you very quickly move into a world where, rather than doing what might be seen as the fun stuff, coming up with ideas, you have to get into the real nitty-gritty, and you have to ask yourself, what could go wrong, rather than where could this take me? So if that sounds negative, it isn't meant to. Research can be very exciting, and the early stages of medical device development, the entire process, can be very exciting. But there is a change in mindset between the very early days of something, whether it's research or the early days of a medical device development, and then the more detailed stuff that needs to happen towards the end of it. And that's one of the reasons, of course, that most startups will maybe have an academic founder or two, but will very often pull in people with broader experience, broader business experience as the process progresses, because you need a different mindset and a different skill set. So the early startup mindset is often one of excitement, and if you're in newly founded startups, congratulations, you've started a really exciting journey, and it is exciting. You'll have new ideas coming around. You'll be potentially working on groundbreaking stuff. You might be developing some really cool technology. Maybe this is your path to untold riches. Maybe you're more interested in saving the world. And if you have an academic background, perhaps actually publications are your major focus. But in any case, the sense of excitement and opportunity will be one of the things that causes a lot of people to found their own business in the first place. When you get into the details, though, of the medical device development program, you need to bear in mind that every medical device needs to demonstrate two key things, and those are safety and efficacy, which we talked about briefly in one of the earlier slides. And even those two words actually aren't as straightforward as they seem, because you might think that for a device to be safe, it needs to be completely safe. But actually, medical devices are almost impossible to make completely risk-free. If you think about it, a lot of medical devices deliberately injure people on their way to solving another problem. If somebody's having a tumor removed, you're having to cut a hole in them to do that. That is inevitably causing damage, although you're doing it with the hope that the limited damage, which should hopefully heal, will be much less damaging than the greater ill that you're trying to solve in the first place. The same actually goes for efficacy as well. You can't prove that a device is going to cure everybody. No device can do. People and diseases are too variable. But this means that you need to be focusing not on making something 100% safe, but as safe as possible. You need to be minimizing the risk to the patient, minimizing the risk to the user. And this area is very heavily governed by standards. And again, this can be quite a different mindset from the research mindset, where you can be largely unconstrained, at least in the early days. And in terms of efficacy, you need to be able to demonstrate that the thing you're developing does what you say it does. So if you promise that it will solve the world's problems, you have to be able to demonstrate that it solves the world's problems. And one of the mistakes we see startups making is claiming too much, or at least hoping to claim too much when they start to develop their medical device. There are lots of tricks that people play here. And one of the more common ones is that people will say, rather than producing a diagnostic device, they are producing something which can aid with diagnosis, something which gives a clinician additional information which they can choose to ignore if they wish to do so. So you're giving them information, but the responsibility for making a diagnosis is not your device, it's somebody else's. And that allows you to claim different things and therefore get things onto the market with a lower hurdle, a lower barrier of proof. And the other thing which is worth mentioning briefly is that a medical device has to do something worthwhile. And that is because all of this is a balance. The results, projected results, must be worth the risks that you are taking. So if you're doing something which is frivolous and it's risky, you're very unlikely to get your CE clearance or your FDA approval. But if you're doing something which is relatively low risk and could have a very big impact, then that's likely to be much more successful. So I don't know how big all of your screens are. If you're looking at this on a mobile phone, you'll struggle, but I'm going to be explaining this in broad terms, so you don't need to be able to read everything which is on here. It is worth remembering that the idea is the very, very, very beginning of the process of developing a product that's going to end up being approved for use clinically. It's the exciting bit, as I said earlier on, but you've got almost certainly several years ahead of you before you end up with a product on the market. We've seen it done in 1 year. 3 to 4 is probably more typical. And if you've got a genuinely groundbreaking piece of research like gene sequencing, for example, that's taken decades to mature from the original discovery of the techniques into things which are products. So these things take a long time. The general process is generally the same, though. You have the idea, you come up with some concepts to find out whether you might be able to, whether it might work. You try to design some initial cheapest possible prototypes so that you can prove out the thing that you're trying to do. You test it. You then develop the next level where you're hoping it's going to be closer to the sort of performance that you might want to put into a real product. And you go around that loop typically a few times, maybe 3 or 4 times before you do the transfer to manufacture, and then you can launch something. So those steps and the 4 big bars across the top, for those of you with small screens, say concept generation, detail design, transfer to manufacture, and then market launch. Those are the development activities, whether it's software, whether it's mechanics or electronics or some other science discipline. The thing that is different between product development outside of the medical space and inside it is everything else that you need to do. And the rest of the things which are coming onto the screen at the moment are the other bits of work which are good practice in any sector, but are actually a requirement if you're developing things in the medical device world. So we're going to talk about a few of these, which are the ones that that typically trip people up, but they include risk management, quality plans, clinical plans, making sure that you can get engagement from clinicians, and move into clinical evaluation and clinical trials. So what we've found over the years is that the areas that our clients are perhaps least expecting are trying to find out what really matters, that first question we asked on a previous slide, and therefore the importance of user research, talking to people about what really matters, showing that you're in control by writing down what you're doing and monitoring against that, and trying to think about what could go wrong and how to manage the risks. Now that may all sound, again, a little bit gloomy, asking, what could go wrong when you're just starting down this exciting path. But actually, I'm naturally an optimist, not a pessimist. And I've learned over the last 23 years that if you spend a lot of time thinking about things that could go wrong, that's the best way of stopping them from going wrong. So we're going to talk about those three areas in a bit more detail. But just before we do, have any questions come in yet that I'm not sure I can see them coming in? Is anything, Ala, is there anything that anybody's asked yet that needs addressing?
If anybody has any questions, please do use the Q&A function.
Yeah, and please do fire in questions at any point throughout this, and Ala will be judging the questions, assessing which questions are good to answer, good to bring up to me, and Ala, if some of those come in at a random point rather than specifically when that little question mark pops up on the screen, then do please say so.
Of course.
Okay, so these are the three areas that we're going to spend the rest of this talk talking about. User research, why it's important and how to do it. Specifications, why they're important, and at least some hints on how to do that. And then finally, some tops on how you can manage risk on the way through things. These areas are often seen as being the boring bits of medical device development. This is the stuff that I said earlier on, you have to do. And a lot of people actually leave these to the end. They'll develop their product and then they'll realize that they've got to do a ton of paperwork and documentation to sort of backfit all of this stuff that they were supposed to do on the way through. If I can give you one piece of advice, it would be to do it as you're going, not because it's a hassle and it just makes it a bit easier if you've already done it by the time you get to the end. But if you embrace these principles, then actually you will end up getting a better product onto the market more quickly and for less money than if you do it at the end. The reason that these processes are enshrined in law, effectively, is because they do lead to better results, even if it feels like it's a hassle when you're starting out. Okay, so what really matters? I would suggest that the most important thing you focus on is what makes your idea properly special. What makes your idea different from other people's ideas? There are always things that you can add onto the core of your idea to make it better, and some of those may well be absolutely necessary. But there is a real danger that you can spend such a lot of time working on nice to haves that all of your money gets sucked up before you can even prove that there's a market for what you're trying to do. Very often, a startup will be working on a device that is sufficiently different that it isn't quite clear that people are going to instantly change their practices. And remember that the medical sector is very conservative with a small c. People are very reluctant to change the way that they have been taught to do a particular procedure. And very sensibly so, because if an existing procedure works well, why would you risk doing something different? So typically, focusing on the thing that really makes your idea different is the way to get something into the market as soon as possible so that you can find out whether there really is an opportunity for you. So where do users come into all of this? Well, ideas usually come from one of two places. Market pull is where a user spots an opportunity for something and then goes and tries to find a technology to solve the opportunity that they've spotted. And we're currently working with a clinician, a surgeon, who is getting repetitive strain injury. He's identified that there is a problem, and he's spoken to his colleagues who've confirmed they get the same problem, and he's had an insight that there ought to be a way of making that problem better by developing some kind of a medical device. So that's a market pull. A guy in the market has spotted an opportunity for a device. The other way, and this is more common when research is coming from universities, is that you get what's called technology push. So a new technology has been developed and it's looking for a market, it's looking for a user need. And that is perhaps the more typical invention process. So why am I saying this? Well, the difficult thing is that most technology startups are full of designers, scientists, engineers, but they're usually not full of users. And I spend at the moment 9 hours a day in my home office in front of a screen, and I can assure you that that is a completely different environment than working in, for example, an accident and emergency department. So it is completely unrealistic to think that designers, scientists who spend most of their time in labs and behind computers, are going to have a good understanding of what it will really be like to use the thing that they're developing in the real world. So users are looking for something which does something better than the last thing they had to do the same thing. That's what if you ask users what they want, the answer is always something better. They never want something worse. What better means is very subjective. It can mean all sorts of things. Easier provides better outcomes, more comfortable saves time, more reliable saves money. And what people want will actually depend on what sort of user they are as well. You tend to think of users of medical devices being clinicians, and they will perhaps be focused on devices which are more comfortable to use, like my surgeon friend who's getting his repetitive strain injury. But we should also remember, of course, that patients are users of medical devices, from implants. They don't never see them, but they're in them. They are the only people who are using them, to drug delivery devices and various monitoring devices, thermometers and all sorts of things, even nail clippers. But there are other users too, and one of the ones which is most often forgotten is the purchasing department within a hospital. And this can be an extremely complicated process. And within the UK hospital system, you will have different budgets for equipment and different budgets for disposables, and trying to navigate the requirements and the preferences for all of these different users can be very, very complicated. So users come in many different shapes and sizes: clinicians, consultants, nurses, care staff, as well as patients, and then the people who fill up the whole rest of the health ecosystem. And just a note at the bottom there that when we talk about users, I'm going to be talking about usability in a second as well. And usability means something very specific in the context of medical devices, and there's a standard for it. And it is a requirement, as you are designing a medical device, that you consult users. So this isn't just something which is a good idea because I'm saying so. You have to do it anyway, but you have to do it because it is a good idea, if that makes sense.
It does, Danny. And before you move on, can I bring your attention towards the questions?
Please do.
We have 2 questions. Would you like me to read them out, or do you prefer to?
Yes, please. Yeah, I can't see them on my screen. I probably could if I looked hard enough, but yes, please read them out.
We have a question from Amanda, and it says, would you recommend going with contract manufacturers who have experience manufacturing products under specific ISO CE requirements that we would need? And the second part of the question is engaging a consultancy specifically dealing with regulations necessary?
Okay, those are two interesting questions and slightly different questions. So the first one, the easy answer is kind of yes and yes, but ultimately somebody needs to be what's called the legal manufacturer of a medical device. That basically means somebody has to take responsibility if it goes wrong. And the legal manufacturer is actually often not the person who literally, or the company that literally clips the bits together and puts it into a box. It's usually the patent owner or the CE file owner. If you're the legal manufacturer, you're responsible for anything that goes wrong with the product. That doesn't mean you go straight to jail if something goes wrong with the product, but it means that you need to be able to demonstrate that you have taken reasonable care in the design of the device and that you've considered risks and so on and so forth. Some of the things we'll talk about a little bit later on. If you use a manufacturing partner who is certified to make medical devices, that is getting you off some of the hook because you don't have to be responsible for the processes that they have internally. If you use a local small company that doesn't have medical approvals, you will need to essentially vouch for them and vouch that the quality of the stuff that they do is good enough. But if you use somebody who is certified themselves to 13485, for example, then you can use their quality system to demonstrate that they know what they're doing, and you only have to worry about the stuff that you're doing separately, as it were. And something broadly similar goes for the regulatory work. We always advise our clients to have an independent regulatory person sitting on their side of the table. Certainly, we give some regulatory advice as well, but we would always want a client to have somebody independent of us. And that is really because the more diverse a range of inputs that you can get, the better in terms of minimizing the chances of something going wrong. So we very much welcome people having somebody separate. You need to have a very good understanding of the regulations if you're going to do it on your own. And if you do, that's great. But as with the manufacturing parties, if anything were to go wrong and it would come to court, if you're able to say, we work with this regulatory consultancy and they really know their stuff and they've got the certification, that's a helpful thing. I hope that answers those questions.
You have time for one more question?
Yes, of course, yeah.
Thank you. Daniel asks, user research is critical, but also something of a buzzword. How can we avoid the camel is a horse designed by a committee pitfall?
Okay, hopefully I'll come on to that in a moment as we're talking through things.
Cool.
But thank you for that question as well. Okay, so I'm just going to very quickly cover off what usability means, because it means different things to different people. And I'm saying this only really because usability is a legal requirement. To you and me as consumers of something like a mobile phone, for example, these words, intuitive, pleasure to use, looks great, comfortable, these are all part of the user experience. And if you were to hear somebody in a pub say the word usability, which is certainly at the moment pretty unlikely, then that is what they would be meaning. But from a medical device context, it's about something being inherently safe by design. So they're related, they're both about how usable something is, but from a medical device perspective, you have to be designing something that is inherently difficult to cock up using. So it is difficult to hurt somebody by pushing the big red button that means deliver 1 million volts, rather than hitting the big red button, which means cancel procedure. And people have been killed by things as obvious as that, when a big red button one patient thinks is the emergency stop button, and one clinician thinks is the apply power to patient button. So I just wanted to get that in there because people talk about usability a lot, and this is maybe to the question earlier on about buzzwords. Okay, why isn't the slide moving? There we go. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how you can get user input, and then hopefully one of the examples I talk about will try to come up with the camels and horses and design by committee. So talking to users is a really, really good idea, because they are the people who will genuinely understand what you need to do. And finding them can be quite tricky, but the 3 routes that most people take are either to use their personal network, and it's amazing how many people know somebody who works at a hospital or know somebody who suffered from the condition that your device is being designed to treat. Maybe that's even why you got into treating the condition in the first place. And if you can find your way in just by talking to people that you know, you'll get a much more personal response typically, and people will be very willing to help, and they may share their network with you more closely. You can also be a bit sneaky, and you can Google the name of consultants in your local hospital that you can find out very quickly from the hospital website work in this area, and try getting in touch directly. You'll get a lower hit rate, but yeah, as I said there, it certainly demonstrates persistence, which can be a good thing. And patient groups can be a very good way to find clinicians. We did some work recently on an asthma device, and the people at Asthma UK were very, very helpful, because they're they're vested in trying to develop better treatments for the particular conditions that they cover. And the final approach is to use a specialist finding agency, and there are numerous companies who specialize in, for example, I need to talk to 6 liver surgeons from 6 different hospitals, please, and they'll go away and find those 6 liver surgeons, and they'll set up meetings with you. You don't need a vast number. 6 or 8 people is usually fine, especially in the early stages, but it's important to try to get a variety of people. And so, although this can lead to the design by committee thing that the question was referring to, if you get 6 people all telling you exactly the same thing because they all work in the same hospital where they've been taught to do things exactly the same way, that won't be truly representative. So try to get people who operate at different levels within the hospital, from consultant down to people on the wards, get people from different locations, and if you're planning on selling internationally, then go international as well. When you meet them, I'm not going to go through all of these, but the major points are, I would hope, pretty obvious. Be friendly and professional. Prepare your questions in advance so you don't come across as if you have no clue what you're talking about. But don't be afraid to go off-piste if something unexpected does come up. As much as possible, ask open questions, and they tend to avoid guiding people down the wrong path. You don't want to say, red's a nice color for a medical device, isn't it? Because there's a very good chance that somebody will say, just say yes, because that's the easy option. Asking, what color do you think this particular medical device should be, is much more likely to elicit an honest response. And try to cover as much as possible about the device and the area that you're looking in. In particular, try to think about the overall care pathway. Where does your device sit? Where will the patient have come from? Where will they be going to? What do the people either sides have in terms of information? What do they need in terms of information? And how could whatever you're doing fit in with that without disrupting things too much? As I said earlier on, the medical profession is conservative. It doesn't really like change. And if you do something which suddenly completely disrupts the flow of a patient from primary care through to tertiary care, that can be a real barrier to your product being successful. So what really matters? Once you've spoken to people about this kind of thing, you should have a chance to start to think about your initial minimum viable product, that this is a thing that focuses on the core part of your design and that doesn't have too many bells and whistles on it. The reason that's good is that you can get something into the market as soon as possible to make sure that it is valid. And there's no need to rush to getting the perfect product out first time round. First of all, perfection just doesn't exist. You would always be able to make something better. But also, a business needs a pipeline of developing products. If you launch one product and then don't launch anything else for 20 years, very quickly you'll be eclipsed by competitors. So having room to grow is actually not a bad idea. So the picture, which is up here on the right-hand side of the screen, shows a very interesting product that we worked on a couple of years ago. The main concept is oxygen delivery to patients who need oxygen to aid their breathing. And what they do differently from anybody else is that they are measuring when the patient is breathing in and turning on the oxygen just at that moment in time. Now that's a good idea because typically patients have a mask over them and oxygen is being continually pumped into that mask. And if the patient is breathing out, the oxygen is just vented out to atmosphere. So by measuring the breathing rate and then turning the oxygen on and off, you save about 60% of the oxygen that's being used. Right now, that's a pretty good thing because for a while back in March and April, and maybe sadly the same will happen over the coming months, hospitals in many parts of the world are going to be very short on oxygen. The image up here shows an early concept render with a nice touchscreen on it showing the pulse rate and the SpO2 levels in the patient as well. But the product which was actually currently envisaged doesn't have any of that stuff. And that's because to add that level of complexity doesn't really add any benefit to the product. Hospitals are full of SpO2 and pulse monitors. So why would you delay the launch of your product by a year to put in a fancy color touchscreen when you just don't need one? So just to finish off this little section, I'm just going to talk about a live example. So we had a client come to us a couple of years ago who had developed a test for something called troponin, which is a material found in the blood if somebody's had a heart attack, a mild heart attack, not the kind of drop on the floor heart attack when it's obvious what's happened. And they came and said, we'd like a handheld device, please, to implement our test in an A&E department so that we can quickly measure whether somebody has had a heart attack. Seemed like a good idea to us. That was fine. So we started to engage with users, and we found 5 or 6 users in 5 or 6 different hospitals around the UK. And we developed our plan on how we were going to talk to these people, interview questions. We were going to process the raw data, glean the insights, and then turn those into the user needs that the engineering team can use to go and develop the product. So the question was, what are your thoughts on small handheld point of care devices? And we were expecting people to say, yeah, they're great, they're really easy to carry around, it's really handy, much better than those big heavy things that get stuck in the laboratory around the back. But actually everybody said something along the lines of, you take them somewhere, somebody puts a coat on them and you never see them again because it gets lost. They're too small, they get lost easily. I've got to change batteries. Where do I get a spare pair of batteries in a hospital from? Actually, I don't need to test near the patient anyway. It would be more convenient for me to take a blood sample and then go back to the back office and run the test in parallel. So this was a great surprise to us, and it was a great surprise to our client. But the insight, and this is the other place where the horses and the camels come together, because ultimately you have to be responsible for your own decisions. You can't just do what 8 different users tell you to do. You have to get all of this stuff and try to reach a consensus internally. The insight was that actually a desk-based point of care device would be more suitable within an A&E department. So the user need is the device should be desk-based. And that then turns into a number of requirements which you give to the engineering team, the development team. The device shall sit on a flat surface like a desk. Its footprint shall be no bigger than this, because one of the follow-up questions was, how much room do you have out the back? And the answer is not very much. They wanted us to be able to tie it down to a desk to minimize the chance of somebody walking off with it. And similarly, and unusually, they gave us a minimum weight target because they didn't want somebody to be able to pop it in a bag and then walk out of the hospital without it being uncomfortable for them. So you ask questions, you get data, you process that data to look for insights, and that allows you to develop the user needs, the user requirements, and then the specification which you give for the designers. And so the actual product that we designed for this particular client was not anything like what's on screen at the moment. It was a much bigger, more substantial device. So that's a very, very quick oversight through how you sort of talk to users and how you can use the information afterwards. Are there any other questions before I move on to the next bit?
Not yet.
Okay, thank you. So, am I in control? Are you in control of what you're doing? As I mentioned earlier on, the medical device space is pretty heavily regulated, and that's a very good thing. If it's you lying on the bed about to go under the knife, you'll be very pleased to know that other people have done this beforehand, and that people have thought very deeply about what's about to happen to make sure that you're as unlikely as possible to come to any great harm. To get that level of confidence, your medical device will need to be audited. It depends a little bit on the classification. Class 1 devices you can audit yourself, but everything else needs to be audited and needs to go through a regulatory process. And your auditor will want to be confident that you're in control of what you're doing. And again, that isn't because they want a big stick to beat you up with, it's because it is a good idea. So even if your auditor didn't want you to be in control of your design process, you should be in control of your design process. You need to know what you're aiming for. You need to have a plan on how you're going to get there. You need to monitor progress against it. And then to get the approvals, you need to be able to prove that you've done it. This doesn't mean that you can't change your mind on the way through, but if you do change your mind, you need to write down that you've changed your mind, and you need to write down a rationale for having done so. Excuse me. So one of the ways of showing that you're in control, and this is one of the key sets of documentation that you need for developing a medical device, both internally and for the regulatory perspective, is a suite of specifications. They're an essential part of any program. Writing down what you need your product to do is a way of recording everything that is important. Now, in the very early stages, it is quite possible that you think it's obvious what you want. You know it, it's in your mind. You're confident that your colleagues know it because you talk about nothing else over the water cooler. But actually, when you write it down, it's quite surprising how often people they'll have heard the same words in the same conversation, but they'll have a different picture inside their mind of what it is you're trying to develop. So it becomes a record. It helps you to ask more questions as you're going through it. You may write something down, and in the process of doing so, you'll think, oh, but I haven't written down. So for example, the previous product, we talked about it having a minimum and a maximum weight. You may write down a maximum weight and then think, oh, I haven't written a minimum weight. I wonder if that's important. Might not be, just an example. But the act of writing stuff down encourages you to think. I think most importantly, though, are these last 3 points. You need to have a shared understanding of what the product is, and that needs to form the instructions for everything else that happens beyond there. So for the design team, but also for manufacturers, and it's also very useful to be able to share the information with investors, advisors, whoever else it is. So it's a common repository of what it is that you're trying to do. And at the end of the process, you can mark yourself against that specification document to find out whether you've actually done it. So in the case of the thing we talked about earlier on, must weigh between 5 and 15 kilos. Okay, you put it on a set of scales and you weigh it. Tick. And then you move on to the next thing. There are also different sorts of spec, and we're only going to talk about the first 2 because we started to discuss those briefly already in what we've said. So a user requirement spec, which you may well have heard of, essentially writes down what the user needs the device to do, the end user needs. It's written from a user's perspective in language that a typical user would understand. And that's really important because you should be checking this with typical users. If you write something down in very technical language that doesn't match the kind of language that the user will use, the chances are they won't understand what they're being asked to check. So it describes what the product should do. It does not explain how the product should do it, and it's largely non-technical. So we often start our user requirements. You have a big list of these. There could be many tens, sometimes hundreds of them. As the user, I want the product to sit on a desk rather than be handheld in the previous example. And the user requirement specification is used to find out whether you've made the right product at the end of the whole process. Ultimately, what you are trying to achieve is a product which meets the user needs because you're trying to sell it to a user who is going to use it. But because it's non-technical language, you can't really set a team of designers to design something must be easy to use or something similar. So you have to sort of translate the user speak into more technical speak, and that's what a product requirement specification is. This is much more technical. It talks about the functional and performance requirements. So the user need we talked about earlier on, it must be heavy enough that somebody can't just put it in their bag and walk off with it. That's a perfectly acceptable user need. But an engineer, it won't necessarily know whether that means 1 kilo, 5 kilos, 15 kilos. So you need to start putting numbers on things. So the product needs to weigh between 5 and 15 kilos, have a mass of between 5 and 15 kilos. And the product requirement specification answers a different question. It doesn't answer whether you made the right product. It answers the question, did we make the product right? Did we make the product that we wrote down that we had to make? So you verify your final design against the product requirement specification. These are things that can be measured, and then you take it back to users and they run a clinical trial and they confirm, they validate whether you've actually got essentially, I suppose, whether you've translated from the user requirements to the product requirements accurately enough so that when you go from the device back into use, you know you've done the right thing. As an example, this is another product. This is a piece of electrotherapy, sort of ultrasonic, forgive me, therapy for relieving stiff necks and things like that. It's used by physiotherapists. There's a control device and there's a handset which is placed onto the patient's skin, and all of the users we spoke to said I can't move this whole thing around. I need a handset that is suitable for handheld operation. And as engineers, we translated that into a couple of requirements about the size, the weight. There are more than this. It has to be waterproof and things like that to cope with people having wet hands and gels and stuff on their hands. So our translation from the user requirements to the product requirements gives us things that as designers and as engineers and as scientists, we can measure to confirm that we have boundaries on this. These are the things that we think we need to design to. And then when we go back in the other direction, we give it to the user and hopefully they will say, yes, this is suitable for handheld operation. The user requirement tends to have softer things in it that are much less numeric, and the product requirements will have more exact, more specific, both called specifications, but the product requirement specification tends to be more specific. This sits into what's called the Waterfall Model, which some of you may be familiar with, and this is part of the medical device regulation. It's also something very similar used in the US. The terminology is slightly different, and the idea here is that you establish your user needs, you translate those into the design needs. So this is the user requirement specification. This is the product requirement specification. That goes into the design process. That's your team of scientists and engineers designing the product. You get a first product out, which you verify against the product requirements. And if it passes all of the product requirements, then you have a medical device that you can put into validation against the original user requirements. I'm not going to read through everything here, but you'll see the words about safe and effective, provided that any risks are acceptable when weighed against the benefits. That's this balance between safety and efficacy. Devices shall achieve the performance intended. This is making sure that you don't claim too much. And something very similar happens with the FDA as well. And here we're talking about verification against the design inputs and validation against the user needs. I'm just going to touch on those very, very briefly. So I hope this isn't too much spoon feeding, but just a couple of tips on how you write things down in a specification, because even this can be surprisingly contentious. The most important thing about the product requirement spec, and this is a spec you'll remember that is going to be given to the development team, is that it is really clear and specific. The whole point of writing a spec is to specify. So saying not too big isn't good enough. You need dimensions. This is really important as well. It needs to be verifiable. So saying performs well isn't good enough. Saying delivers 10 watts of power is, because you can measure that it's delivering 10 watts of power. So to be able to verify that something works as you want it to, you need to be able to measure whatever that is. Yeah, stick to one requirement per point. If you have two things and it passes one and fails the other one, then you've got what looks like a bigger failure. Make sure you use consistent language. We use shall, should, and may. So a product shall do something. It absolutely must do that thing. It should do something that you'd really like it to do. And it may is something that can do, don't really mind too much either way. It is acceptable. So that can sometimes be something which would be regarded as negative, but you have decided it is acceptable. It's generally a good thing to point down what something should do rather than what something shouldn't do, but sometimes, shall do rather than shall not do, but sometimes that's unavoidable. Traceability, this is going from user requirements to product requirements. So if your user requirement is shall be desk-based, and that translates into 4 product requirements about footprint and weight and being able to tie it down and so on and so forth, you need to be able to illustrate that to pass that user requirement, these all 4 of these product requirements have been designed to and tested. Most importantly, keep a record of everything that you're doing, and always start out by thinking about the final product, even if you're going to go through 3 different rounds of prototyping on the way through, because that way you don't end up backing into a corner, suddenly finding out that you can't add the final thing that you'd forgotten about because it wasn't in the spec. It's fine to have a specification which talks about the final product and then explicitly says, but I'm not going to do that for the alpha prototype. I'm not going to do that for the beta prototype, but it's a good idea to have it in there so it doesn't drop off by mistake. Any questions on specs?
No, all clear, I think.
I haven't drummed you into submission,
Oh,
I
hang
hope.
on, one second. Sorry, we did have a quick question come in. It says, if you are a researcher, designer, clinician, and you believe you know what the gap is to a degree, how will the device need to be engineered in order for it to be worthwhile new product? So it's not, rather it's not a user evaluation we need to undertake as opposed to a user requirement mapping.
Yeah, I think the question was, if you're coming at it from the user perspective, how do you start to brief an engineering team almost? Is that sort of what's in? Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that if you're a user coming with a problem, so this is like the market pull thing we were talking about earlier on, talk to some colleagues, get them signed up under a non-disclosure agreement if you need to do so, but make sure that it isn't just you who thinks it's a problem. We have come across quite a few projects where one individual will have a very strong opinion as to how something should be done, but they can't really find anybody else who agrees with them. And it may be that they're genuinely revolutionary and they've got an absolutely brilliant idea, but it may also be that they've just got a little bit stuck in a rut perhaps, or that they've got completely obsessed by one particular idea. So I would certainly recommend talking to more than one person. If you're then looking for people and help to design it, then sitting down with technical people, with engineers, and trying to explain what you're doing in the languages that you understand so that they can translate it into the engineering requirements is a good idea. Some hospitals have got their own clinical engineering departments. My business, and of course others like us, do exactly this as well. I think that probably our biggest contribution, the design work that we do, I think is very strong, obviously, but I think our biggest contribution is often made in the translation from the clinical ask to what that really means in terms of the product. Because once you've got over that hurdle, you can start to design something which is going to meet the need.
Thanks, Danny, that was clear.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the final bit we're going to talk about is managing risks. This is the bit that I said at the beginning can sound a bit miserable because you start asking yourself all sorts of glum questions about what's going to go wrong. But as I said earlier on, if you ask questions about what could go wrong, you're already halfway to stopping them from going wrong in the first place. So to manage risks, you need to identify those risks. You need to think about what might go wrong. You then need to work out how much of a concern that really is, do something to minimize the chance of it happening, and then go around the loop again. So you spot that there's a potential risk, you do something about it, you rescore it essentially, and then you go round until the level of risk is acceptable. You need a process to mitigate those risks, and there is a standard for this as well, as you might expect, ISO 14971. There's a standard for just about everything in the medical world. So identifying risks. The picture I've popped up here is of a device which is still under development for a company called Ablatus Therapeutics. It's an ablation device, and it's slightly different from most typical tissue ablation devices in that it couples two different ablation modalities to give an effect that is greater than either of them combined. The long sharp thing that you can see there with the white handle is the bit that gets stuck in the body. In this particular case, it's going into the liver. And the box at the background is the control unit. And in this particular case, we've got a lot of risk around. We are trying to cook part of somebody's body whilst they're still alive. Essentially, that's what ablation is. So we're sticking a needle into a tumor in the liver, and we're trying to cook them from the inside, and just to cook the tumor. You don't want to cook all of them, obviously. To do that, you need a lot of power. You need to plug it into the mains. So we've got a live bit of metal stuck into somebody's liver whilst they're still alive, plugged into the mains. There are lots of risks. So how do you even start to think about them? Well, the first thing to recognize is that risks come in different shapes and sizes. So you have system-wide risks, which tend to be the fundamental questions like, how can I make sure that 240 volts isn't going to kill my patient? And then as you get sort of into a more refined, a smaller level, a finer level of detail, the design risks come down to maybe individual components. How do I know this piece of plastic isn't going to snap when the plastic handle isn't going to snap when I push it into the patient? How do I know the needle isn't going to buckle when I push it into the patient? Then you have quality risks, and there will be commercial risks as well. I'm going to need to spend this much money to develop it. What's the market size, and so on. So identifying risks is a very important part, but it can be quite tricky as well. And ultimately, you just need to sort of get on and do it. You need to sit down and draw up a list of everything that you think could go wrong. We would strongly suggest a structured approach to make sure you don't miss anything off. And that can be, in the case, for example, of this product, you could think about everything that could go wrong between those 3 pins being plugged into the mains, the power going into the box, going through the circuitry internally, the user making their decision on the user interface, and the power ultimately being delivered down the needle. Or you could do it literally on a component by component basis. You could draw up a big list of all of the bits and try to think about everything that's going to go wrong, but try to make sure that you don't miss anything out. It is important, and indeed it is a requirement of the regulations, that you sit down with a group of people who are suitably qualified to pass judgment. If you go into a primary school and ask them what's going to go wrong, those answers will not be valid. You need to sit down with people with a certain amount of experience in a relevant field, such that an auditor would say, I can understand why you asked that person to come and help you with this. And it's always a good idea to use people from without the project, people who will ask awkward questions based on a lack of understanding rather than a deep understanding. Each of the risks that you come up with, and in the case of a project like that, there would have been well over 100, will have a different likelihood and severity, how often it's likely to occur, and how bad the impact could be. So what you need to do is to go through everything on your list and assign a likelihood and a severity. And you typically end up with a map which looks like this. So you can score the frequency with which something's going to happen, 1 to 5 in this case, from very unlikely, improbable, up to frequent. And you can define whether frequent means every use or every 3 uses or whatever it is. And you can score how serious the effect would be. So negligible may be the patient, well, maybe literally nothing at all. Minor might be the patient gets a scratch. Serious could be the patient gets a minor flesh wound. Critical could be the patient is seriously injured, and catastrophic could mean death to the patient. You have to go through this for all of the risks that you've identified. And anything that's a low risk, you can essentially regard as being okay, being dealt with. But then to mitigate those risks, anything that's high risk will need to be addressed, and ideally medium risks would need to be addressed too, but it isn't always possible to do everything, and you need to exercise a degree of judgment. Usually you mitigate risks by changing the design and or introducing a way of detecting that there is a problem before it becomes catastrophic. So in the case of the ablation process we talked about briefly earlier on, we can't actually detect that the entire liver has been ablated, but we can measure the amount of current that is being put into the body, and therefore we can work out whether there is a fault on the system. So even though we can't measure what's going on to the patient, we can infer it based on a measurement elsewhere. And you have to repeat this process until all of the risks are acceptable. So that is a 3-minute guide on how to tackle risks, very, very high level. But you need documentation of this as well to submit with your technical file. So those are the 3 areas that we've talked through. All of these things are required as part of your regulatory submission. They're not optional, but that's a good thing because they all help you to develop a better product in less time. You'll need to demonstrate that you've done all of this stuff. And then ultimately, once you get through this, you'll need this information as well to submit your device for ethics approval for any clinical evaluation, which is almost certainly what you're aiming for, actually getting your product in a clinical trial so that you can demonstrate that it's effective. And the planning and conducting of clinical trials is the topic of the next webinar, which is being held by Nicola Wall at the same time on Thursday. And that's all I have today, other than final contact details. And if anybody has any further questions.
Thanks, Danny. I think we have one big general question for you, and it's what's your rule of thumb regarding FDA regulations, and is the best way to go about it outsourcing?
Wow, that is I think so to apply to the FDA, you need somebody who understands the process very well, as you do really for CE marking as well. The geographical distance makes it a little bit harder than it is in the UK and EU. So whenever we have been involved in an FDA submission, there has been an external party involved as well. And I think if I had to recommend anything, that is what I would recommend. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for listening, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye.